Good evening. Today I'd like to focus on one historian in particular, J. Frederick Faust. Faust's early work in the College of William and Mary focused primarily on the English expansion of the James River in the early 17th century. More specifically, Faust's initial work focused on Anglo-Powhatan relations and the Great Indian Uprising of 1622. For this week's discussion, I like to zero in on three specific pieces by Faust. First, the abundance of bloodshed on both sides, England's First Indian War, 1609 to 1614. Second, the invasion of Virginia, Indians, colonialism, and the conquest of Kant, a review essay on Anglo Indian relations in the Chesapeake. And finally, the barbarous massacre reconsidered, the Powhatan uprising of 1622, and the historians. In an abundance of bloodshed on both sides, Faust describes the initial relationship between the first English settlers and the impacts of the Powhatan people on that colonization. Here, Faust talks about the initial peace and cooperation between the two cultures, and how the cultural differences and incongruent priorities eventually lead to suspicion, tension, and ultimately war. As Faust puts it, this first war wasn't a one sided event. It wasn't the Powhatans descending on helpless settlers or blatant English expansion. Rather, Faust's work attempts to put politics and culture at the foreground and upend long-standing ethno-historical beliefs. In The Invasion of Virginia, Faust writes at length about the culmination of those early interactions between the Powhatans and the English, or the Great Indian Uprising of 1622. While English colonists and those in England believed that relations had normalized in Virginia, the aggressive expansion, both physically into new settlements and culturally as the English began to convert and assimilate the indigenous tribes, pushed the Powhatans to the breaking point. While Faust does a great deal of scholarship in describing these events, his main thrust is more on the historiography related to the uprising and a thorough review of primary sources to adequately give balance to the perspectives of both historical narratives. Finally, in A Barbarous Massacre Reconsidered, Faust comes full circle and spends considerable time evaluating the historiography of the massacre. He first unpacks the veracity of the primary sources of the event. These were documents and accounts from Edward Waterhouse, Sir Francis Wyatt, and John Smith. Then Faust takes to task the historians who utilized these primary sources exclusively. Taking his ethno-historical approach, Faust scrutinizes the historiography of the event and charts the historical narrative from its inception through the 17th and 18th centuries. While Faust's work is considerably older and deserves revisiting, his ethno-historical approach takes the long-standing historiography and attempts to shine new light on the works of Alexander Brown, Wesley Frank Craven, Charles Campbell, and Gary Nash. Faust's points on ethnohistory and ethnocentrism speak to the Eurocentric nature of the historiography of the time period and the bias of primary source materials towards English documentation. While the scholarship towards the Powhatan perspective is vast and the primary sources numerous and rich, too often when speaking of the early Virginia colonial period, we as historians fall back to the same overtreaded paths of John Smith, Thomas Dale, George Percy. Faust's research seeks to show both perspectives and look at the founding of Jamestown, the spread of the colony, and the First Anglo-Powhatan War, culminating in the 1622 uprising through cultural tension and not as a plantation of a people into an uninhabited land. I look forward to your feedback on Faust's work. Thank you.